Good evening and welcome to New York City Atheists Live on Tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I'm your host, Dennis Horvitz, the David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned. No doubt many of you have been asking yourselves, what does paganism have to do with our holiday celebrations? Well, I know you've been staying up late at night worrying about this, and as usual, we've come to your rescue. Don't thank us. To address this question, our topic today is Wicca and neopaganism, tribal and spiritualism for today's world. What do paganism, the solstice, and Christmas have in common? Quite a bit, apparently, and who better to explain these similarities than a pagan? So, our guest today is Margot Adler, the grand... Margot. We're not going to edit this either because we're just so open and honest about our shortcomings. That's what I told my ex-girlfriend. Okay, very bad. It is. Oh, by the way, we are broadcasting from our winter solstice party. So this is hell on earth if you happen to be aware. So our guest today is Margot Adler, the granddaughter of the famous psychoanalyst Dr. Alfred Adler. She attended the University of California at Berkeley and the Columbia School of Journalism. She is a reporter for National Public Radio in New York City and a regular voice on NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Ms. Adler is the author of this book, Drawing Down the Moon, Witches, Druids, Goddess Worshippers, and Other Pagans in America Today, which I will try not to get my fingers on the title. You can just do a close-up of that. It's considered a watershed in American neo-pagan circles as it provides the first comprehensive look at modern nature-based religions in the United States. She was raised by atheist parents in New York City, but craved ritual and spirituality in her life. After graduation from college, she discovered a whole movement of people who were reviving and resurrecting in modern form the ancient pagan religions. Calling themselves witches, goddess people, druids, they practice an undogmatic tribal religion based on doing as opposed to creed-based scripture-oriented religions, which are mostly about believing. To borrow a phrase from Abraham Lincoln, it is altogether fitting and proper to have a pagan as our guest at our winter solstice party and to explain the ancient religion of paganism, its rites and rituals, and how neo-paganism fits into today's world. Please welcome Margot Adler.
Like that? Okay. Hi there. Hello. And it's, of course, it's like French, you know, Margot. But anyway. So let me tell you a little bit about, I'll start by just telling you a little bit about my background and how I got to be doing all this stuff, which was, I grew up in New York City, the child of what I would call, as I sort of lovingly call, sort of atheist Marxist parents, you know, and when I was 5, I was told that our religion was the brotherhood of man, which as a 5-year-old girl didn't quite really cut it, you know. It was a little boring. It was a little boring, you know, and I have to say that my best friend who was Catholic and had the white dress and the whole thing, I thought at that time, little did I know, that she had a better deal. And of course that was at a time when the Mass was still in Latin, so you could go and visit her church and be drenched in the medieval ceremony because you didn't understand a thing they were saying. And obviously at some point they changed the liturgy and then it was like, oh my God, what are they saying? Oh my heavens, oh, whoa, weird. Anyway, so my story is that I basically, when I was a child, I went to a very progressive, wonderful school in Greenwich Village called City and Country. And in City and Country, when I was 10, they took the whole class to the country at 4 a.m. in the morning on May 1st. And we picked wild flowers as the sun rose, and we danced around the maypole, and we strew flowers in various people's arms when we came back to the school. And I think what really happened to me was I became a ritual junkie for life. I just loved the kind of, I guess I loved the beauty, the imagination. I didn't want any beliefs attached to it, but I just loved the stuff that was around it. And then when I was, 3 years later or so, when we were in 7th grade, we studied ancient Greece for the whole year. And I mean, for the whole year, and I decided that the Greek goddesses, and remember, this is the late 50s, the Greek goddesses were clearly better role models of women than anything that was going on in the popular culture at large. Artemis and Athena were clearly tough cookies compared to anything I was seeing in the magazines around me. And I didn't want to worship them, I wanted to be them. That is the truth. But I love the idea of the ancient Greek religion for this point, not because I wanted to worship, but because I wanted these images of strength and power in my life. And then I became 14, and you don't go around saying that you're, that you really are into the Greek religion because you really want to be a goddess, without ending up in a mental hospital. So I pretended that all this stuff didn't exist. And I basically, I got involved in the 60s. I got involved in politics. I later wrote a book called Heretic's Heart, Journeys Through Spirit and Revolution about the 60s. And I basically pushed this all aside. And it wasn't until maybe my mid-20s when I got very involved in the ecology movement. And I got very involved in the nature writers, Thoreau, Lauren Isley, all those people, all those wonderful, wonderful, beautiful nature writers. And I realized there was something powerful about connecting to the cosmos in what could only be described, in my lack of words, a kind of religious way, but a non-religious religious way. I mean, there was some kind of connection to the earth, to the stars, that was so powerful in these nature writers that I thought, well, that's really my religion. Well, is there that's my religion. Nature is my religion. Maybe that's it, So I was looking for some way of combining this love of nature, nature religion, these ancient goddesses, whatever. And I remember right around that time, this is like the early 70s, John McPhee had written a book called Encounters with the Archdruid. And in this book, he went on 3 nature trips with various environmentalists, various developers, and he was the environmentalist. And at one point he goes out with this developer, and this developer says, "You're a druid. You like trees better than people." Now this was the Nixon administration. I was like in Washington with some very awful people, and I thought, trees do seem a lot better than people. What were the druids? What in fact are the druids? Let me find the druids. Maybe that's what I am, right? I mean, remember, I'm in my early 20s. I don't know much about what I'm doing. I'm kind of searching in that way, right? So I end up in England looking for the druids. I open up the London telephone directory under D, for druids, right? And I finally, by the time I leave, I find something called the Druid Order and something called the Order of Pagans, Bards, and Druids. And I start getting these magazines because I write them letters saying, "Hi, I'm looking for an ecological religion with a holistic view of the world. Are you it?" And they would write back things like, "Well, we don't know if we're it, but we believe in ecology, and for £1 you can subscribe to our magazine," and stuff like that. And one day, after I had started getting these magazines in the mail, I get a letter in the mail, and it says, "Dear Margot, we are a priestess and priest of witches in Essex, England." And I thought, wait a minute, wait a minute, whoa, what? And we see you're a member of the pagan movement. And I'm thinking, I'm not a member of anything. I am not a member of anything. What do you mean I'm a member? I said, my wife and I are high priest and high priestess of a coven of in Essex, and I drop the letter to the floor. I drop it to the floor. I think, because the W word had not reared its head at this point, the witch word. And so I basically, it was all about, nature, religion, who knows, So I start writing them letters, and they write me letters, and they say, "Well, for such and such money, you can get tapes of our ritual." Well, I can play that game, too. I had a radio show on WBAI. I said, "I don't have any money, but if you send me a tape of your rituals, I might put it on the air." So the rituals come. This tape comes. It's a joke. It's a total joke. I'm saying, "You won't believe it, friends of mine. I'm corresponding with witches in England. It's totally ridiculous. It's the most funny thing in the world," right? It's 1971 we're talking about. This is happening. I open the tape finally. I get the tape recorder with the right speed. I put the thing on the tape recorder. And what is it? It is a ritual. And it's a ritual. And of course, it's British voices, so I'm hooked. It's Brahms in the background. It's gorgeous. And it says, "Hear ye the words of the great mother who was of old, also called among men," and then are all the names I used as a 12-year-old when I was studying Artemis, Astarte, Diana, all that stuff. And then the woman in the ritual, in a British accent, takes on the role of the goddess. She becomes the goddess. And I go, oh my God, she's becoming the goddess, and she's not in a mental hospital. Whoa, I guess I could do this too. Woo! So that's the true story of how I got involved in paganism. Now that I've told you that, I will tell you why, what I found out, what it's really about, etc. But I was looking for an ecological religion, I guess you would say, and one without any dogma. So after I started getting into these groups, or trying to find these groups, I found that, like all things, there's dogma everywhere. There's probably dogma in atheism, there's dogma in witches, there's dogma everywhere. First group I entered, they said to me, "We believe in the threefold law, that everything you do comes back to you 3 times." And I said, why not 2.5? Right? Or they'd say, "We believe in the goddess." And I'd say, I don't know if I believe in a goddess. I think a goddess is a great image, a great metaphor. It's a great thing of becoming and power and women and feminism, but I'm not sure I believe in a goddess. Well, what I found out was that, in fact, the thing that was wonderful about this contemporary burbling up pagan movement was that you actually didn't have to believe in anything, because the basic premises of the pagan movement was that it operated as, in many ways, as what I would call a tribal religion versus a creedal religion. And what I mean by that is this. If you think about Judaism, you don't have to believe in God to be a Jew, right? You're part of the tribe. And essentially, if you think of all the, well, let me start back one place. All of your great, well, I don't know how far back, depending on where your culture is. If you're Irish, maybe 11th century. If you're Jewish, way back. But if you look at all of your ancestors, way back, they were pagans. Every single one of you. And what I mean by that is they were part of religions, or part of worldviews. We don't even have to call it a religion, really. They were part of worldviews that essentially their spirituality came from essentially looking at natural. First of all, there were no books involved. There was no literal scripture involved. There were no prophets involved. This was essentially, oh, what do we do to help the plants grow? What do we do to sort of harmonize ourselves with the cycles of life and the seasons? What do we do to heal this rift in our community? What do we do to help heal this person? These were all what I would call doing questions. In other words, what do we do to do this? It wasn't necessarily a belief. And so what I would say is that there is a tendency within these what I would call tribal religions. And I would include a lot of Native American, I would call Aboriginal, all those kind of sort of Aboriginal kind of religions are part of this. Not that they can't have dogmas in their own way and stuff like that, but at root, they are very much rooted in what I would call the earth. So that the fundamental principle for me about this pagan resurgence is that the primary thing is that if you want to talk about sacred, what's sacred is the here and now. You don't have to die to get the good stuff. Now, what was fascinating to me growing up as a Marxist atheist family, in a Marxist atheist family, was, and I just started remembering this when I was talking to Alex here, who's from the French press, I started remembering Marx's famous quote on religion. And most people only know the first couple of words, religion is, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulish conditions, the opium people. That's what people know. Opiate of the people. But if you go further and look at the rest of that quote, which is an amazing quote, he basically says, disillusionment with religion, criticism of religion disillusions man or disillusions human beings, so that he can think and act within his own reality and revolve around himself and be his own true son. Religion essentially is the flowers with which his chains are decked. Criticism of religion tears down the chains so he can pluck the living flowers. Now for me, I have been fascinated my whole life with what did he mean by the living flowers? Because for me, I think there is what I would call a spirituality without religion, that I think in some way he was trying to talk about. Now, when I talk to a lot of, when I talk to sort of pagans, one of the things I'll say to them is, almost all the pagan groups in America, and we're talking about people who are reviving Norse religions, a lot of what's going on in this pagan religion movement is people going back to their roots in a certain way. So for example, you're Irish, you know, you want to go back to sort of some of that Irish stuff, the Dagda, the Danann, whatever it is, you know, you start doing research, you start reading some of the old stuff, you start looking at it, but you want it in a non-dogmatic form. Similarly, and a lot of people who come from Welsh backgrounds are looking at the Mabinogion, which is full of all kinds of ancient gods, pre-Christian Welsh stuff. So a lot of the people who are involved in the recreation of the pagan movement are essentially looking at their own roots in a certain way and trying to figure, well, what's good about that? Because, let's face it, if you look at the people in our world, in our country, let's say, just have our country, if they're African American, their traditions were destroyed through slavery. If they're Native American, their traditions were destroyed through colonialism. And if they're just ordinary European Americans, white people, their traditions were pretty much destroyed by immigration, assimilation, wanting to become Americans, etc. Now, some of those traditions should be destroyed. Some of those traditions were dogmatic and horrible and disgusting. When my mother, who came from a somewhat Orthodox Jewish family, she got the 25-cent Hebrew teacher, really, that could only mouth the words, whereas her brother, because he was a boy, he got the 50-cent one, where he learned the meaning of the words, you know? She left home at 18, married a violinist, became a bohemian. She said, out. Out with all those traditions. She changed her name, pretended she was half French and half Jewish. She did a lot of really strange things, right? Now, what I'm saying is that there is what the contemporary pagan movement in this country is it's a group of people who want to resurrect, recreate, revive in new forms, what I would call the good parts of those old traditions without the dogmatic bad parts. So, for example, you know, there's a funny group that some of you may know about called the Society for Creative Anachronism. They call, they're people who revive the Middle Ages, not the way they were, but the way we would like them to be. Right? I mean, you know. And so similarly, I would say that when I start talking about the history of this pagan movement, of this contemporary pagan movement, very much of it is creation of a paganism with, you know, in the modern world, somewhat as we would like it to be, and not perhaps as it was. Because the truth is, we don't know what it was. Most of these traditions were oral traditions. Most of these traditions were destroyed. A lot of people will tell you, oh, I have a tradition. Some of the witches will tell you, I have a tradition that goes back 10,000 years. Yes. Right? I mean, there wasn't, who knows what was going on 10,000 years ago, right? I mean, you know, who knows, because there wasn't writing. It's very hard to even know what was going on at that time. So, basically, the main points are this. These are religions that are based in that the sacred is in the here and now. The sacred is in the seasonal changes. And yet, why ritual? Because I think human beings need to bond. Human beings need to have ways of being with each other that are powerful. And ritual sometimes does that. I mean, why should only the holy rollers get to completely speak in tongues? Why shouldn't we be able to, I mean, really, why shouldn't we be able to dance around a bonfire, you know, until in total ecstasy, and then go to sleep and get up and be doctors and lawyers and computer programmers the next morning? I mean, why shouldn't we be able to have all of those realities? So my belief really is that the pagan movement came about in this country and in England and in some parts of Europe. This revival came about, and the history is very similar. It's simple. There were people, always, obviously, indigenous people were doing paganism and still are doing pagan religions that are tribal, et cetera, et cetera. What happened in this country and in England and in Germany was people started doing research into these ideas. The Romantics started looking at them. The folklore movement started doing this in the 20s and 30s and so forth. In England, what happened was a whole bunch of people. It was a woman named Margaret Murray. She wrote a book in 1921 called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. A lot of it's been disproven. A lot of what she says is completely bogus. But she had an interesting idea that the remnants of what were the sort of ancient beliefs before Christianity in Western Europe and in England and so forth were these pagan ideas that were still around and were in a lot of the festivals. For example, one of the things that's been researched very clearly is that most of the church sites in England are all on ancient pagan grounds. They are almost all, and you can see this in many places. You'll go into a church and you'll see that, and then you'll see the 7th century crypt, and then you'll see the sun, and then you'll see the Roman ruins or whatever. So because when Christianity became the sort of powerful religion that it did, basically what it first did was co-optation. So it first didn't do persecution. It basically tried to say, oh, you know, this is where you celebrate. Okay, we'll do this here. We'll do the same celebration here. We'll do the same. We'll build our church right here on your ground, etc. In fact, the original name for pagan basically means of the country, paganus. So the paganus were the people who kept to the old ways. The first people who came to Christianity were in the cities. The Romans, who got converted, you know, Constantine, all the Roman emperors got converted. The people who never heard the news were the pagani, or the heathens, the Hicks. The heathens who lived on the heaths, the pagani who lived out in the countryside, they were the people who never heard the news. And so essentially, pagan means hick, or it also means country dweller, or something like that. It also, in many languages, means people. So that the pagan religions, you could say, are people religions. Are religions based on the earth, on people, on humanity, but not based on prophets, scriptures, etc., etc. Another thing that I think is really, really crucial to the ancient pagan religions and to these modern ones is that pagans do not proselytize. They do not assume that their religion is appropriate for anyone else. Now that's true except for the Lubavitch of Judaism, again, another originally tribal religion. You were not, you know, the Lubavitch are doing all this proselytizing. It seems completely antagonistic to the basic ideas or beliefs of sort of tribal Judaism, etc. But that's also true in certainly Native American religion or any kind of basic indigenous religion that you come to. They're not trying to get you to join. You know, you might try to get yourself to join, but basically they're saying this is our way, it may not be appropriate for you. And similarly, modern pagan religions, witches, etc., basically say, if it's right for you, you'll find it, but it's not necessarily right for everyone, and that's fine. And so what that means is it has a view of multiplicity, which I think is really important. It says there are multiple ways of being, multiple ways of believing, that it's good to have many different paths and beliefs, that the world is a richer, more interesting place if in fact there are many different ways of looking at the world, of looking at religion, etc., that that's a better, more rich, more interesting way of seeing the universe than one truth, etc. So I think that one of the things that's really interesting about this whole modern pagan perspective is that it is very much in keeping with what I would call a liberation-oriented, multiple, you know, sort of broad-based way of looking at the world. Another thing is I think it doesn't necessarily rely on the supernatural at all. That doesn't mean that you're going to find witches all over the place or into the supernatural, that are into magic, that are into this, that, and the other. You're going to find pagans who believe in reincarnation. But what I'm going to argue is none of it is necessary. That essentially, while you may find some who believe that at bottom, it is essentially a view that is in some way what I would call, in a way I'd call it shamanistic, but in a way I'd call it, a friend of mine has a word, he calls it an open metaphysic. And what he means by that is this. He says, if you don't have a literal scripture, well, you could never have a creationism evolution debate, because it would be impossible. Because if you have an oral tradition or something, you'd say, if you have a shamanistic view, you'd sort of say, well, Yeah, that's my creation myth, and I believe that. That's part of my dream reality, my artistic reality. But then there's science over here. They don't contradict. It's perfectly reasonable to have both of those. One is an artistic reality, one is a scientific reality. No problem, right? So in a certain sense, I think that, at least ideally, I think that the modern pagan religions basically do not require anything of what a friend of mine says, there's no need for a supernatural, just think about the superpower of the natural. And what he means by that is, you know, we're only using 10% of our brain or whatever it says. There's so much just in the natural that is powerful. For me, when people ask me, well, what about magic? Witches do all this magic. What about that? I said, you know, I'm not so sure there's much different between psychology and magic. That half of what goes on in magic is really getting your mind into a different place so the world seems different, so you're more able to access certain things. It's a lot of the insights that almost all the psychologists have had, from Maslow to Freud to whatever. You know, all those insights are basically psychological insights. Now, that doesn't mean that maybe we'll find, you know, that science will one day prove that there are certain abilities that some people have. Maybe there is some small amount of telepathy in the world. Who knows? But I don't think you need a magical, supernatural explanation for any of these things that we're talking about.